Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
What happens when legendary singer Sir Cliff Richard sits across from Denise Welch on Loose Women to debate whether phones should be banned in schools to protect children's focus? At first, it looked like a typical morning segment, two British icons discussing a topic every parent has an opinion on. Denise, known for her fiery takes and outspoken nature, came prepared to defend kids' digital freedom. Cliff, calm but firm, spoke from the heart about what he's seen in schools, families, and society since smartphones became part of every child's hand. The exchange began politely enough until Cliff questioned whether adults were hiding behind the phrase modern parenting to avoid responsibility. Denise bristled. The room shifted. What followed wasn't just a debate about phones. It became a confrontation about values, attention, and the loss of innocence in a tech-driven age. As Cliff's voice rose and Denise's patience thinned, the audience found themselves watching something that went far beyond policy. It was a generational clash. By the time it was over, one of them would walk off the Loose Women set, and it wouldn't be Cliff. The moment went viral overnight, sparking a nationwide conversation about how far technology should go before parents and schools finally say enough. The cameras rolled and the familiar bright backdrop of Loose Women glowed behind Denise Welch. She smiled, poised and confident as she introduced her guest for the morning. "Joining me today," she began, "is a man who's been entertaining the world for over 6 decades, the legendary Sir Cliff Richard." The audience applauded warmly as Cliff walked in, dressed sharply but humbly, offering a polite nod before taking his seat opposite her. There was mutual respect in their greetings, but a faint tension hung in the air, one that viewers could already sense would grow thicker. Denise set the tone with her trademark energy. "Today we're asking a question every parent, teacher, and student seems divided on. Should mobile phones be banned in schools?" Cliff, you've been very vocal about this recently. You actually think phones are damaging kids' ability to focus, right? Cliff clasped his hands, leaning forward slightly. "I do, Denise. I think we've reached a point where distraction is disguised as progress. Kids are losing their ability to listen, to pay attention, to be bored even. And boredom used to spark imagination. Now it just sparks scrolling." A ripple of nods spread through the studio audience. Denise, however, raised an eyebrow. "But surely, Cliff, banning phones isn't realistic. Times have changed. Technology's part of life now. Schools can't just turn back the clock." Cliff gave a patient smile. "I'm not saying we turn it back. I'm saying we slow it down. There's a difference. If a 10-year-old spends more time looking at a screen than talking to a teacher, something's gone wrong. Kids need guidance, not gadgets." Denise leaned back, her tone sharpening. "But who decides that, Cliff? You? Me? The government? Some parents rely on those phones for safety, to check in, to make sure their kids get home. It's not all bad." Cliff nodded. "I agree, there's good in it. But we've blurred the line between necessity and addiction. Schools should be sanctuaries for learning, not notification centers. I've seen classrooms where students can't go 10 minutes without checking their screens. That's not education, it's dependence." The audience murmured again, louder this time. Denise glanced at them, clearly aware of how his words were landing. "So you'd take phones away from every student, just like that? Isn't that a bit, authoritarian?" Cliff chuckled softly. "I'd call it discipline, Denise. We used to teach children to write letters, to look each other in the eye. Now they communicate in emojis. And we wonder why anxiety and loneliness are on the rise." Denise smirked, though her tone carried an edge. "With respect, Cliff, you sound like every grandparent who says, 'Things were better in my day.' Maybe kids are just adapting to a different kind of world." That line earned a few laughs from the audience, but Cliff didn't flinch. "Maybe, but just because the world's different doesn't mean it's better. We can't keep calling decline evolution." The laughter faded into silence. Denise's smile tightened. The polite debate was clearly shifting. Cliff had just challenged not only modern parenting, but the very mindset of progress that Loose Women often celebrated. Trying to lighten the mood, Denise joked, "Well, if phones were banned, half the kids wouldn't know what to do with themselves during break time." Cliff didn't laugh. Maybe that's exactly what they need, to not know for a while. To think, to talk, to be human again. It was the kind of sentence that landed heavily. You could hear the quiet in the studio, the kind of silence that happens when truth touches a nerve. Denise adjusted her cue cards, forcing a small smile as the camera zoomed in on her face. "All right," she said. "I think we're just getting started." And everyone watching knew. She was right. The politeness wouldn't last much longer.
Denise Welch leaned forward in her chair, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to something more pointed. The warmth of daytime television began to fade, replaced by the sharper edge of a real disagreement. "So, Cliff," she said, her tone measured but pressing, "you're saying the solution is to take phones away from children entirely? Do you honestly believe banning them will make kids suddenly start reading Shakespeare again?" The audience chuckled, sensing her sarcasm. Cliff smiled faintly, but didn't look away. "No, Denise, but I believe removing a constant distraction might help them focus on something. And it's not just about Shakespeare, it's about attention, discipline, and self-respect. You can't develop any of those when your brain is constantly pinging for the next dopamine hit." Denise tilted her head, unimpressed. "That sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? Kids have always been distracted by something. Comic books, radio, television. Every generation has its version of the thing ruining youth." Cliff's voice stayed calm but firm. "Except this time, it's not just a distraction, it's a dependency. Back then, a TV show ended. Now, the scroll never stops. Kids aren't just watching content, they're being fed by it, shaped by it. We've turned technology into a parent." The audience murmured, half in agreement, half in surprise. Denise took that cue and jumped in, clearly not ready to let him control the narrative. "But that's not technology's fault. It's up to parents to set boundaries. We can't blame phones for bad parenting." Cliff's smile faded slightly. "And what happens when those parents are addicted too? When dinner tables are full of screens instead of conversation? It's a cultural issue now, not just a parenting one." Denise crossed her legs and leaned back, trying to maintain control of the tone. "But that's exactly my point. You can't solve a cultural problem by policing kids' phones. You can't legislate morality or focus." "Maybe not, but you can lead by example. If schools made a stand, others might follow. Imagine if kids spent even half the time they do online engaging with each other face to face. We'd raise a generation that listens, not just reacts." There was a brief pause. The crowd broke into applause. Cliff nodded politely, but Denise's smile tightened. She could feel the energy shifting away from her. She spoke louder now, her tone a mix of disbelief and defiance. "But come on, Cliff. Banning phones sounds like something from another century. Don't you trust kids to make responsible choices?" Cliff looked at her, his voice lowering. "When I was their age, responsibility meant earning trust. Now it's given out like candy, and kids are drowning in it. You don't hand a 10-year-old a smartphone full of the world's chaos and say, 'Good luck.' That's not trust, that's neglect." That line hit like a strike. Even Denise seemed momentarily caught off guard. She glanced at her notes, but didn't look down long. "All right," she said sharply. "So you'd rather go back to chalkboards and paper? No tablets, no online resources, no communication tools?" Cliff smiled again, but this time it carried a sharper edge. "I'd rather go back to connection, when a teacher's voice mattered more than a notification tone, when you learned from people, not algorithms." The words hung heavy. Denise's voice rose slightly, trying to regain the upper hand. "That's nostalgia, Cliff. The world's moved on. Technology has opened doors. Disabled kids can learn through apps, parents can track their children, and information is available instantly. You can't deny that progress." Cliff nodded slowly. "You're right. It is progress, but progress without limits becomes chaos. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Technology should serve people, not replace them. The audience applauded again, and Denise's expression tightened further. For the first time, she looked genuinely annoyed. "Okay," she said, tapping her pen on the table, "but you're painting a pretty bleak picture, aren't you? You talk like we're living in some dystopian nightmare. It's just kids on their phones, Cliff, not the end of civilization." Cliff's tone dropped, measured but heavy. "Denise, I've seen what obsession does, what it steals. The spark in young people's eyes when they talk about real dreams, not viral fame. The patience it takes to build something meaningful. That's disappearing. And if you call that normal, then maybe I'm the one out of touch." That line turned the mood. The laughter and chatter stopped. Even Denise seemed unsure for a moment. Finally, she laughed awkwardly, breaking the tension. "Well, this is certainly more intense than I expected." Cliff nodded again. "That's because it's real. It matters." The audience erupted in applause once more, sensing that something deeper had just been said. Denise smiled at the crowd, but her eyes darted toward the cameras, trying to pull the energy back to her. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "if this is just the beginning, I can't wait to see where this goes." And that line would prove true, because things were about to turn from passionate to personal, and neither of them would be able to step back from what came next.
The atmosphere in the Loose Women's studio had shifted. The playful tension from earlier was gone. What replaced it was raw, unfiltered friction. The audience could feel it. Denise Welch, usually light-hearted and composed, was now visibly defensive. Cliff Richard sat upright, his tone calm but cutting, every word landing like a quiet truth she didn't want to hear. Denise took a deep breath, trying to pivot. "Cliff," she said, "I respect your opinion, but don't you think you're being a bit, elitist? You talk about connection and real life, but most families can't afford tutors or private schools. For some kids, a smartphone is their only connection to learning." Cliff looked at her gently, but his reply was unflinching. "Denise, I didn't grow up rich. I learned by talking, by observing, by living. You don't need a $1,000 phone to learn humanity. You need guidance, discipline, and care, none of which come from a touchscreen." Denise raised her eyebrows, the defensive laugh gone now. "But that's the world we live in. You can't expect kids to grow up in 2025 like it's 1955. That's not realistic." Cliff's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're right, but realism isn't an excuse for surrender. We've surrendered our kids' attention to companies that profit from addiction. Tell me, Denise, when did we decide to stop protecting them?" The room fell quiet. Even the audience seemed unsure whether to clap or stay silent. Denise shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. "That's a very dramatic way to put it, protecting them. You make it sound like parents are failing." Cliff didn't flinch. "I'm saying society is failing. When we let algorithms raise children, we fail. When classrooms look more like Wi-Fi zones than places of learning, we fail. And when adults defend the very distractions that are breaking our young minds," he looked directly at her, "we fail them twice." That last line landed hard. Denise blinked several times, caught off guard. She tried to respond, but her tone betrayed irritation. "So now you're blaming me personally. Come on, Cliff. I'm not defending addiction, I'm defending reality. You can't bubble wrap the next generation." Cliff leaned in, his tone suddenly sharper. "Reality doesn't mean giving up. You call it adaptation, I call it apathy. We keep saying, that's just how it is. Well, that's how everything decays." The audience gasped. Denise exhaled, visibly flustered. "You're twisting this into some moral sermon. I'm saying kids need balance, not bans." Cliff nodded. "And yet balance doesn't exist in an environment built to keep them hooked. You think balance happens by accident? No, it takes courage. The courage to say, enough." Denise looked down, then back up, her voice tightening. "You sound like you want to take us back to the Stone Age. Do you really think kids can function without phones in this world?" Cliff's voice softened, almost sad now. "Maybe they'd function better without them, Denise. Maybe they'd rediscover silence, imagination, curiosity. Things we're losing, one click at a time." That line drew spontaneous applause. Denise smiled faintly, but the tension in her jaw showed she was rattled. She tried to recover. Look, Cliff, I get where you're coming from. I do. But the world doesn't stop spinning because you don't like the direction. Change isn't evil, it's inevitable. Cliff smiled back, but there was something in his voice that cut deeper than anger. It was disappointment. Then maybe the problem isn't change. Maybe it's that we've stopped questioning who's changing us. The studio froze. The audience erupted after a beat, clapping and cheering. Denise forced a smile toward the camera, but her face had gone pale. She shuffled her cards, pretending to check notes. "All right," she said with a strained laugh. "Let's take a quick break before Sir Cliff turns this into a philosophy lecture." But it was too late. The energy had already shifted. And when they came back from that commercial break, it wouldn't just be tension in the air. It would be confrontation.
When the show returned from the break, Denise Welch was visibly tense. The cameras caught her tight smile and restless hand gestures as she tried to steer the conversation toward lighter ground. But Cliff Richard wasn't finished. He sat calmly, hands folded, the picture of quiet conviction. His stillness only made Denise's agitation more obvious. "All right," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Before the break, Cliff had some strong feelings about smartphones in schools. Let's just say the audience had mixed reactions." A few uneasy laughs rippled through the crowd. "But Cliff, do you really believe banning phones will suddenly fix focus and discipline? Isn't that just avoiding the real issue, how kids are taught?" Cliff tilted his head slightly. "Denise, when the classroom becomes a competition with TikTok, we've already lost the real issue. Teachers aren't entertainers. They shouldn't have to fight for attention against a screen." Denise let out a sharp sigh. "You're romanticizing the past again. Kids have always been distracted, passing notes, staring out the window, daydreaming. Phones just changed how they do it." Cliff leaned forward, his voice calm but piercing. "Passing notes didn't rewire a child's brain. Phones do. You know that. We have data, studies, proof, yet we keep ignoring it because adults don't want to confront their own dependency." The audience clapped again, louder this time. Denise forced another smile, but her voice grew edgier. "So what then? We just take away every kid's phone and pretend that solves everything? That's not how the real world works, Cliff. Kids need to learn responsibility, not be policed." Cliff's eyes softened, but his words hit harder than ever. "Responsibility begins with boundaries. We're supposed to teach them, not test them. You don't hand a child something addictive and say, 'Learn to control yourself.' That's not guidance, it's negligence." Denise's jaw clenched. "Negligence? You're walking a thin line there." "I'm saying it because I care. Every week we hear about rising anxiety, depression, attention disorders, and we still act like it's just coincidence. It's not. It's cause and effect." Denise crossed her arms. "You're not a psychologist." "No, I'm someone who's seen generations change before my eyes. When I meet young fans now, they don't look present. Their eyes are somewhere else, behind the glow of a device. That's not progress, Denise. That's loss." The studio fell silent. Denise's tone turned cold. "You're speaking like technology is the enemy. It's not. The problem is people refusing to adapt." Cliff's voice rose for the first time, firm and clear. "The problem is people adapting without asking what they're adapting to." The audience gasped. Denise blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the sharpness in his tone. She tried to cut him off. "All right, Cliff, we've heard your sermon." But Cliff interrupted, his frustration now showing. "It's not a sermon, Denise. It's a warning. We're trading childhood curiosity for dopamine hits. We're teaching kids to scroll instead of think." That line drew a mix of applause and murmurs. Denise, red-faced now, slammed her cue cards on the table. "That's enough. You don't get to come here and lecture parents or teachers like you've got all the answers." Cliff didn't raise his voice again. He simply looked at her, disappointed. "I'm not lecturing, Denise. I'm pleading, because we're running out of time to undo what we've done." The tension was unbearable. The producer's voice crackled through Denise's earpiece, urging her to move on, but she didn't. She took a long breath, turned to Cliff, and said through clenched teeth, "You might be used to being adored, Cliff, but this isn't one of your concerts. You don't control the show here." Cliff smiled faintly. "No, Denise, but truth has a way of stealing the spotlight, doesn't it?" The audience erupted again, cheers, laughter, and scattered applause. Denise froze. The cameras caught the flicker of anger in her eyes before she stood up abruptly. "All right, we're done here," she snapped. "We'll be right back." The music cue rolled awkwardly as the screen faded to commercial, but by the time they returned, Denise Welch was gone. Her seat beside Cliff was empty, her nameplate quietly removed. And Cliff, ever the gentleman, looked into the camera and said softly, "Sometimes honesty clears the room before it clears the mind."
When the cameras came back, the set felt oddly still. Denise Welch's seat was empty, the tension hanging in the air like leftover static. Cliff Richard sat quietly, hands folded, as if the silence itself was an answer. The other hosts didn't return. It was just him, the audience, and the echo of what had just happened. The floor manager gave a subtle signal. "Continue." Cliff took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and leaned toward the camera. "You know, I didn't come here to argue. I came to talk about something we're all feeling but nobody wants to admit. We're losing our grip on what it means to be present." The audience stayed silent. His voice carried a calm gravity that filled the room. "When I was a boy, distraction meant something simple. A bird outside the window, a daydream during a lesson. But now, distraction follows us everywhere. It sits in our pockets, buzzes on our nightstands, and calls to our children before they even learn to speak. And we call that progress." He paused, looking down for a moment before raising his eyes again. "I'm not against technology. I use it. I benefit from it. But I fear we've stopped asking whether the tools serve us or we serve them." Some people in the audience nodded quietly. Others just watched, reflective. Cliff went on, his tone almost tender now. "We talk about freedom online, about access and connection, but freedom means very little if it comes at the cost of attention, empathy, and peace. Seniors, children, adults were all drowning in noise and mistaking it for information. And maybe it's time someone said, 'Enough.'" He gave a small, bittersweet smile. "I didn't mean to upset Denise. I understand her passion. We're all trying to make sense of a world that's changing faster than our hearts can keep up with. But if we can't talk about it, really talk about it, then we've already surrendered more than just privacy or focus. We've surrendered the conversation itself." A few people in the audience clapped softly, then more joined in until the sound grew into a steady applause. Cliff nodded, almost embarrassed by it. He adjusted his jacket, preparing to leave. As he stood, he looked around the set one last time. "When I walk off this stage, I hope someone, maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, takes a moment to look up from their phone and really see the person next to them. Because if we can still do that, maybe all's not lost." He gave a quiet, polite wave to the audience and turned to leave. No drama, no bitterness, just a quiet exit from a man who had said what needed to be said. As the camera followed him walking backstage, the applause continued. You could almost sense a shared realization, an understanding that the conversation wasn't just about phones, schools, or kids. It was about all of us. The screen faded to black with the studio's logo, but the message lingered long after the show ended. If you liked this powerful moment, make sure to subscribe for more celebrity clashes, emotional showdowns, and unforgettable TV moments. Drop a comment below. Do you think phones should be banned in schools?